Good evening. For months, the story coming out of Washington was one of dominance. President Trump stood at podiums, threatened 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods, and told his crowds that America's northern neighbor had no choice but to bend the knee. The narrative was simple: pressure Canada, and Canada folds. But tonight, we have to report a very different reality. A reality where the quiet neighbor to the north did not fold. A reality where the United States is not winning. And a reality where one of the most respected investors in American history, Warren Buffett, is now warning that the country is learning an expensive lesson. Donald Trump got it wrong. Not slightly wrong, dangerously wrong. And the price the United States is now starting to pay, it is not small. Let me ask you something. Since when did a country like Canada, long seen as the quiet, almost invisible neighbor, manage to put Washington on the defensive? The answer is simple: overconfidence. The kind that blinds you completely. For months, Donald Trump did what he always does, threatening tariffs, rallying crowds with fiery speeches, posting on social media that Canada was cheating, taking advantage of American workers. The usual script. And behind the scenes, his team was convinced this would end the same way it always ends. Pressure Canada hard enough, and they will fold. His advisors were certain. They said Canada had no choice. They said its economy depends too heavily on the United States to survive without it. They said Prime Minister Mark Carney would eventually come crawling back to the negotiating table, desperate for a deal. Sound familiar? That kind of confidence? Some would call it strategic clarity. Others would call it pure delusion. Because reality hit, and it hit hard. Mark Carney did not respond the way Trump expected. No emotional outbursts, no rushed retaliation, no signs of panic. And that was the first warning sign. Because when your opponent refuses to react, it usually means one of two things. They are either too weak to respond, or they are preparing something much bigger. And this time, it was not weakness. While Washington was busy talking, posturing, and escalating rhetoric, something very different was happening behind the scenes in Canada. Quietly, methodically, step by step, with surgical precision. And here is the part that should make every American sit up and pay attention. Trump did not even realize he was walking straight into a trap. He thought he was applying pressure, but in reality, he was being outmaneuvered. Think about that for a second. If your opponent does not fight back, does not argue, does not push back, maybe they are not losing. Maybe they are waiting. And what Mark Carney did next did not just surprise the White House. It shook the foundation of how this entire trade relationship works. Because while Trump believed Canada would fold, Canada was already rewriting the rules of the game. While Washington was busy making noise, Mark Carney was making moves. Quiet moves. The kind you do not notice until it is too late. For nearly 3 months, behind closed doors and far away from the spotlight, Carney was doing something that frankly Trump's team never took seriously. He was building an entirely new trade network. Not small-side deals, not symbolic gestures, real structural agreements with major global players. Europe, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, and yes, even China. Now, here is where it gets almost unbelievable. Trump's people actually saw fragments of this happening. Reports, signals, early discussions, but they dismissed it. They thought it was political theater, a bluff, a negotiating tactic to gain leverage before Canada inevitably came back to Washington. They misread the situation completely, because Carney was not bluffing. He was not posturing. He was constructing something far more dangerous to American interests. An alternative system, a parallel trade framework designed to function with far less dependence on the United States. And then the switch flipped. Just days ago, Canada rolled it all out at once. A coordinated announcement of sweeping trade agreements that, according to early estimates, could reduce Canada's economic dependence on the United States by nearly 40% within just 2 years. 40%. Let that sink in. That is not a minor adjustment. That is a strategic shift. That is Canada stepping out of America's shadow and doing it faster than anyone thought possible. And the impact, it is already being felt. Canadian lumber, something American construction companies have relied on for decades, is now being redirected toward Asian markets. And here is the painful part. Those buyers are reportedly paying more than many U.S. firms were willing to pay. In other words, America is not just losing supply, it is being outbid. Pharmaceuticals, another critical sector. Canadian generic drugs, which millions of Americans depend on every single day, are now getting preferential access to European markets under these new agreements. Priority has shifted. The United States is no longer at the front of the line. And then there is energy. This is where things get really serious. Canadian oil and natural gas, long integrated into U.S. infrastructure, are now being locked into long-term supply contracts with overseas partners. Stable contracts, predictable revenue, and most importantly, alternatives to the American market. Do you see what is happening here? This is not retaliation. This is not emotion. This is strategy. Carney did not take the bait. He did not walk into Trump's tariff trap. He went around it completely. And by the time Washington realized what was happening, the structure was already in place. And here is the uncomfortable question every American policymaker should be asking right now. What happens when your closest trading partner no longer needs you the way they used to? Because that is exactly where this is heading. And if you think the consequences stop at Canada, you are about to be very surprised. Because this is where the pain begins. What looked at first like a bold move by Canada is now turning into a very real economic shock for the United States. Not theory, not speculation. Well, real consequences, measurable damage. And when someone like Warren Buffett steps in and says America is learning an expensive lesson, you pay attention. This is not a political figure. This is not a media voice chasing headlines. This is one of the most respected investors in American history. When he speaks, markets listen. According to reports, Buffett did not mince words. He essentially said that when you destroy a long-standing trade relationship based on impulse, without fully understanding the consequences, the market will correct you. And that correction, it is expensive, very expensive. We are starting to see exactly what he meant. American industries that were built on stable, predictable access to Canadian resources are now scrambling. Supply chains that took decades to optimize are being disrupted in a matter of months. And the costs are not in the millions, they are in the billions. Take construction. The U.S. construction sector is now projecting a 17% increase in material costs in the next fiscal quarter alone. 17%. That is not normal inflation. That is a direct result of Canadian lumber becoming harder to secure and significantly more expensive because it is being redirected elsewhere. And it does not stop there. The auto industry, one of the pillars of American manufacturing, is starting to feel the squeeze. Canadian parts suppliers, once heavily tied to U.S. contracts, are now shifting production toward Europe and Asia. Why? Because those deals are longer term, more stable, and frankly, more attractive than what they're being offered in the United States right now. So what happens next? Delays, shortages, rising costs. And eventually, those costs get passed down to consumers. Then we have pharmaceuticals. And this one hits even closer to home. Canada produces a significant portion of the generic medications that Americans rely on. Now, under the new trade framework, those supplies are being prioritized differently. First for domestic use in Canada, then for export to European partners. American pharmacies are already starting to feel the pressure. Certain medications are becoming harder to source. Availability is tightening. And for some patients, this is not just inconvenient, it is dangerous. And then we get to energy. This may be the most underestimated mistake of all. Trump seemed to believe that America's talk of energy independence meant it could easily walk away from Canadian oil and natural gas. But that is not how infrastructure works. The pipelines, the regional grids, especially in northern states like Michigan and Minnesota. These systems were built around Canadian integration. You cannot just replace that overnight. And now, energy costs are rising. Heating bills are climbing. And as colder months continue, that pressure could get worse. Because Canadian suppliers are now tied into long-term agreements with other markets. And those commitments come first. Let that sink in. For years, the assumption was simple. Canada needed the U.S. Now, the reality is shifting. And the United States is the one feeling the squeeze. This is exactly what Buffett was warning about. Not just financial loss, but the breakdown of something far more valuable. Reliability, trust, stability. Because once those are gone, rebuilding them is not easy. And if you think this is just an economic story, you are missing the bigger picture. Because what is happening now is starting to turn seriously, dangerously political. When economic pain hits real people, it does not stay in spreadsheets. It moves into state capitals. It reaches governors. It pressures lawmakers. And that is exactly what is happening inside the United States right now. States that depend heavily on Canadian trade are starting to push back hard. Governors in northern states, places like Michigan and Minnesota, are raising alarms, not quietly either. They are dealing with rising energy costs, strained supply chains, and businesses that are suddenly facing uncertainty they never planned for. This is not partisan noise. These are local leaders staring at real consequences in their own economies. And here is where it gets even more serious. There are now growing discussions in Washington about limiting the president's power to impose sweeping tariffs without congressional approval. Think about that for a second. Lawmakers on both sides are beginning to question whether this kind of unilateral trade escalation is too risky. That does not happen unless there is fear, real fear. Meanwhile, Trump's response has been chaotic. First, he tried to dismiss everything, claimed Canada was making a mistake, said they would eventually come back. But behind the scenes, even his own advisors reportedly understand that is not likely anymore. Then came the tariffs, more pressure. But by now the flaw in that strategy is obvious. The more tariffs you impose, the more expensive those goods become for American businesses and consumers. It is a self-inflicted wound. And then came the moment that really revealed the shift in power. Trump reportedly sought a direct one-on-one conversation with Mark Carney, a chance to regain control, to negotiate, maybe even to salvage leverage. Carney's response, a polite no. His office released a statement saying the Prime Minister's schedule did not allow for a call at that time, while formal diplomatic channels remained open. In diplomatic language, that might sound neutral. But everyone who understands international politics knows exactly what it means. That was a brush off, a calm, calculated signal that Canada is no longer operating under pressure, that it is no longer rushing to respond to Washington's timeline, that it now holds enough leverage to wait, and that changes everything. Because for decades, the assumption was simple. The United States sets the pace and others follow. But now, for the first time in a long time, America is not the one controlling the tempo. And Mark Carney, quiet, precise, and completely unshaken, is playing a very different game. While Trump escalates, retreats, and recalculates, Carney stays the course. No drama, no noise, just execution. And here is the question that should concern every American watching this unfold. What happens when your opponent is not reacting to you anymore? Because they no longer have to. Because if that is the case, then this is not just a negotiation gone wrong. It is a complete shift in power. And what comes next goes far beyond Canada. Because what we are witnessing right now is something much bigger, a signal to the entire world, a shift in how countries see the United States, a shift in how power actually works in global trade. For decades, the assumption was clear. America leads, others follow. Access to the U.S. market was the ultimate leverage, and countries like Canada were expected to align, adapt, and cave when pressure came. But that assumption is now being tested in real time. Other nations are watching this very closely. The European Union is watching. Japan is watching. Even countries in Latin America, long accustomed to operating under strong U.S. influence, are watching and asking a very uncomfortable question. What if dependence on Washington is no longer necessary? Because Mark Carney just demonstrated something powerful. If you plan carefully, if you diversify, if you build alternatives before the crisis hits, you do not have to fold under pressure. You can stand your ground. And that changes the equation for everyone. This is no longer just about tariffs or trade balances. This is about credibility, about trust, about whether the United States is still seen as a stable, reliable partner or an unpredictable force driven by impulse. And that is where Warren Buffett's warning becomes even more important. When he talks about expensive lessons, he is not just talking about dollars and cents. He is talking about relationships that took decades to build, supply chains that were trusted, agreements that were stable. And what happens when all of that is suddenly thrown into uncertainty? Because in global trade, trust is not a luxury, it is an asset. And right now, that asset is being damaged. Meanwhile, Canada's position is rising, not because it is bigger, not because it is louder, but because it has been disciplined, strategic, and prepared. Mark Carney is not celebrating. He is not taunting. He is not playing politics. He is simply executing a plan, one that he clearly designed long before the first tariff threat was ever announced. Compare that to what we are seeing from Washington. Mixed signals, internal division, and a strategy that seems to shift from week to week. The contrast could not be sharper. So now the question becomes, what happens next? Trump has options, but none of them are easy. Escalate tariffs further and risk even more damage to American consumers and businesses. Negotiate and admit that the leverage is not what he thought it was. Or do nothing and watch the relationship continue to erode. None of those paths lead to a quick victory. And while this plays out, the rest of the world is adapting, adjusting, learning, because the lesson here is clear, and it is not the one Washington expected. Power does not belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the side that prepares better, thinks longer, and moves smarter. Canada just proved that, and the world is paying attention. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.